He did not cry when he lowered the child into the pit, and that is why the wind has never stopped screaming over this valley. They tell me the soil here remembers more than bones, that it remembers hands and breath, and vows that were never meant to be spoken aloud. What they found buried here defied every known law of nature, or so the archaeologist whispered when he thought the cameras were off, because the skeleton was whole, but the bones did not fit the age they measured, and the resin that sealed the mouth was older than the teeth. The father's tools were still there, arranged with a neatness that suggests ritual or guilt, a row of obsidian blades no more than a finger long, a loop of braided hair preserved by bitumen, and a wooden mask carved with an expression that the living rarely wear for long. Why was the mask turned inward, as if it had been forced to watch the boy's last sight? And why was the jawbone of a lamb tucked into the crook of the child's arm? And why did no one speak of what happened next when the video cut to black, and the field journal ended with a dull red fingerprint where a name should have been? The cave is not a cave so much as an opening in time, a mouth of rock that drinks light and returns it as cooled, thin breath. And when you stand at the threshold, your ribs will ache, as if you are trying to remember a language you were born knowing and later forced to forget. I should not have looked closer, but the hand that brushed the dust from the child's skull trembled in a way that made something inside me lean forward, as if this story had been waiting for a listener, as if the father's defense could still be heard by anyone willing to hold his gaze. The paper scraps lodged behind the slab of limestone were written in a script that no one exactly recognized, as if a scribe had copied a prayer from a dream and then woken to find his ink frozen mid-stroke. And yet the names sounded familiar. The river, the dead gate, the herds without hooves, the little boy called seventh to breathe. You saw that too, didn't you? The way the camera refocused on the boy's molars while the microphone caught a second voice counting under its breath, and the count skipped every seventh number. And then the wind outside rose like a mouth closing. The first line we can read says the father did what was demanded, that he felt the weight of 7 generations, pressing his head down until the crown touched stone and the stone warmed. And in that warmth he finally understood how quiet the world would have been if he had been born childless. He was not an evil man. The notes insist with a violence that suggests protest rather than clarity, because he loved to carve flutes and hollowed bird bones, to make whistles for the children to run to the fields, and he laughed at the way their feet tangled in the rye. He was the most patient with the child who did not sleep, the one who woke with the moon and paced the layer of packed clay that served as a floor, tapping patterns into the dirt that matched no known rhythm and yet sounded like the pulse of someone who had never quite made it to shore. Among the debris packed around the pit, they found more than stones and bowls. They found fish spines aligned like writing, ash that had been kneaded with oil until it shone, and a tiny bell made of copper that could not possibly have existed at that date, and yet it rang the moment air touched it. If this is true, and if the bell was rung in the father's hand, then the question is not how he could do it, but why the village allowed it. And if they allowed it because they believed the child was not fully theirs, then what did they believe he was? We are taught to imagine ancient times as heavy with superstition, but those men and women counted the stars with more precision than some astronomers manage with machines, and they knew the tides not as metaphors, but as schedules, and they drew maps and knotted cords that pulsed against the wrist like living veins. A second skull lay beneath the boys, separated by a layer of woven reeds that looked like sleep, and the second skull was not human, and the lamina of its bony roof was ridged in a way that made everyone in the room take a step back without meaning to. The technician who cleaned it says the ridges catch light like teeth, and that sometimes, when the overhead lamps buzz, you can see the suggestion of a soft spot that never quite closed, as if the thing beneath had stopped changing mid-syllable and then learned to hold its breath for centuries. What were they waiting for? And why was the boy placed as a lid? And if the ritual had sealed a mouth then, who was it meant to silence? The child or what lay below? The paintings on the cave wall were made with black manganese and red ochre, and the figures are not running or dancing as they do elsewhere, but standing very still with their heads tilted, as if listening at a doorway, and their hands are raised not in fear, but as if to measure a wind that doesn't move cloth, and yet moves thought. Every seventh figure is drawn with a gap where the face should be, and inside the gap someone later scratched a smaller face, a child's face with closed eyes, and next to each is a tally mark that ends in a hooked curl like a fish hook or a knot we can no longer tie. At first the team thought they had found a community caught in the logic of famine or plague, a desperate calculus where one life might balance a ledger of mouths and days, and the initial report wrote the word sacrifice with a steadiness that looked like certainty even as the air in the tent went cold. But the isotopes in the boy's bones told a different story, one of abundance, of a diet rich in river protein and wild grains, and the wear on his teeth said he chewed sweet tubers until his jaw ached, and the small ridges where muscles attached said he spent more mornings running than kneeling. If hunger wasn't a reason, then what story requires you to quiet a child who can outrun the dawn, and what God demands joy as a down payment? It would be easier if the father had been a man apart, someone disliked or feared, a shadow among torches, but the artifacts insist otherwise, because his knives were a communal gift, and his name is carved into a donor stone at the kiln, and the grave goods include a pair of small boots that were mended twice, with care that isn't faked for burials. The boy's boots were tucked beneath his knees, and inside one boot was a brittle lash of feathers braided with dog hair, and when the conservator separated the strands, she swore she found something like milk, dried into a sheen, and she said the smell was wrong, because it smelled not of sourness, but of iron and summer. I am not trying to shock you, only to tell you what they wrote in margins when they could no longer keep their hands steady. And if the margin notes look like prayers, then remember that prayer is often an attempt to make an argument to time. The father kept a ledger of numbers cut into wood, counters for sheep and counters for days and counters for breaths held while diving, and then a column of marks that no one has translated, marks that rise and fall, stutter and repeat, marks that fit the cadence of breathing during panic, and then resolve into a neat line, as if the breath has finally decided whether it needs to continue. It is possible, one anthropologist suggests in a late-night recording that sounds like confession, that the village believed their river had a mouth that sometimes opened into the sky, and that when it opened the air itself learned to carry sound like a throat, and that such throats sometimes caught names, and that if a name was taken no sleep would come to the named until the mouth was closed with the counter-name, weighted by blood. What would you have done if your child paced every night and whispered to the stone like a door on the other side of breath, and if the dog refused to enter the house, and the eels that used to coil easily into baskets lay straight and stiff as rules, and if the geese refused to fall silent when the moon was full, and if you woke to find your child staring at the reeds as if counting a species that had never evolved? He did not choose alone. Or so the elder's ring found near the pit seems to claim with its inscription of 40 notches, a number that belongs to meetings and storms, and the way its bronze tastes of salt suggests it was worn into rivers, raised to sky, and buried with a kiss that no one wanted to give. The mask that watched inward had a tongue made not of wood but of leather set with small teeth stitched in with sinew, and if you think that is merely grotesque, then ask yourself why anyone would give the mask a taste, and what it means to leave a palate in the dark. He was seen, in the days before the burial, walking with the child to the hill where the river narrows and the air is always cooler than it should be, and he brought a handful of lamb's wool and pressed it to the boy's chest as if to muffle a drum, and they sat until the evening insects began a dissonant chorus that men write down as night, but which, when heard up close, sounds more like teeth learning to pray. There are prints in the clay that do not match the father's or the child's, a third pattern that is narrower than it should be, and very long in the heel, and the archaeologist measured them twice, and then stopped, because the results felt like asking a question out loud in a church when the sermon has not ended. Evidence wants to become story, but story wants to become wanting, and so we find ourselves leaning toward the pit, as if a whisper might rise that would unburden us of the need to invent, and yet the only voice is the river echoing through stone, and the echo is older than any man. The boy's skull has a healed fracture on the left parietal, smooth-edged and shallow, sustained months before his death, and near the healing there is a line of small punctures that look like the marks a comb might leave if dragged without pity, and perhaps this is evidence of nothing, or perhaps it is a map of a father who tried everything else first. If you listen to the late recordings, you can hear them choking on not knowing, the way investigators do when evidence runs out, just as the shadows begin to feel the shape of a person. And one night someone asks if the river here ever freezes, and someone else says it freezes from the bottom up. And the room goes silent as if every one of them has decided to stop walking at the same time. The pit itself is lime-lined, which means they knew what they were doing, and the angle of the walls suggests it was built months before the burial, which means the decision was not sudden, and the absence of scratching on the inner stones means the child did not try to climb, and the presence of smooth smears of resin on the rim means someone gripped the edge hard enough to leave fingerprints and gloss. When they lifted the boy, hardened resin cracked like quiet thunder, and the bell rang again, soft and apologetic, as if it had been designed for the inside of a chest, and when the sound faded the insects outside fell silent for one entire breath, and then returned with a fury that sounded like gratitude. Nobody has yet explained the second tongue they found. A strip of leather sealed within the boy's mouth alongside his own, braided with thin reeds, and drilled with holes like a flute, and the holes were aligned to numbers that repeat in patterns across the site, and the reeds come from a marsh miles away, where no paths run and nobody now goes after rain. It would be easy to invent a cult here. A coven of men in masks, a ring of women cutting their palms into bowls, but the truth resists costume, because the truth says the family stayed afterward, and the father continued to mend shoes, and the mother continued to carry bowls to the kiln, and someone cut the grass above the pit until it lay like hair brushed by a steady hand. They say the air inside felt like something was still breathing, and I know you do not believe in such sentiments, but tell me why the torch flame changed when it crossed the mouth of the pit, thinning as if drawn through teeth, and tell me why the photographs taken inside the burial come out subtly darker along the edge where the child's hands would be if he had lifted them to block his eyes. Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking what crime had been committed and started asking which silence it had cured, and when we realized we had made that turn, shame made us call it objectivity. The father's flutes, found wrapped in a cloth under a stone shelf, were carved with holes that do not fit any known scale, and yet those who put lips to them before the conservator shouted, said it felt like breath had a guide, like the sound did not come from the flute, but found the flute waiting at a bend in its path. There is a pattern painted on the nearest wall, a loop closed with a knot, and inside the loop is drawn a fish with its mouth open, and from the mouth emerges a small hand, and the hand holds a knife that cuts the rope, and all of this is upside down, which means either the painter stood on his head or the painter wanted the fish to be sky. If the river here opens to a mouth in the sky once every 7th winter, then perhaps the boy was born at the wrong bend of the calendar, and perhaps his name, 7th to breathe, was not a place in the family order, but a promise the heir was owed, and perhaps the father stood between oath and child and chose in the only language he believed the sky would understand. You are thinking it too, aren't you? That you have heard a child talk in his sleep in a voice older than his teeth, that you have woken to find your own hands clenched as if holding something you do not own, that you have watched the dog look at a corner where there is no furniture and refused to enter with a growl that sounds like resignation. He waited until the geese refused the water and walked along the bank like penitents, until the sheep bleated without pause, as if their throats were teaching themselves stone, until the hour when the river's sound seemed to come from the sky more than the valley. And then he wrapped the boy in reeds and lifted him with an efficiency that belongs to those who have practiced emotion in dreams. He whispered to him, though the resin would come later, whispered as if the ear might carry the words into the marrow, and keep them from rising too fast, and we do not know what he said, only that the wind that night was recorded as changing direction 7 times in the span of 1 hour, and the plants along the cave mouth leaned, and then leaned again, like worshippers, misled by bells. There's evidence they tried the other rituals first, before the pit, before the tongue, before the mask, because in the ash of the hearth they found threads of the boy's hair woven into braids with red thread, and in the storage pit they found a small doll carved from tallow with the soul scraped clean, as if to teach it silence. And on the roof they found circles of dust where jars had sat, and the jars were simply gone, lifted away, or taken elsewhere through a logistics we do not understand. What if the boy's pacing was not restlessness but courtesy? Steps measured to a rhythm that only those standing on the seam of a world can hear. And what if the father watched his son move in the moonlight and realized the boy's feet were not on the floor so much as on a line drawn between 2 mouths? And what if that line began to hum? If he believed the line would tear if the boy stood still, then what would he owe to the house and the river and the others who lay their children down, believing the roof would hold? And what would it cost to make stillness possible again? And could you ask a boy who knew the secret of walking that line to give it up for a bed and morning chores? The day before the burial, he went alone to the marsh where special reeds grow, and he cut them low by feel because mist had turned the world into a bowl. And when he returned with the reeds bound in a cord from his own belt, he was seen looking at the sun, as if measuring how long a shadow can keep a promise. People will tell you there are born monsters and made monsters, and that the two are easy to tell apart. But in the carved handle of his favorite knife, they found a tiny groove worn where the thumb rests when the blade is used to peel fruit, a comfort groove, a habit, and evil rarely has such amenities. He walked into the cave at dusk when light is not light but permission, and he placed the mask so it would see what he could not bear to look at. And perhaps this was a mercy, because someone in the room should testify later that they had seen the thing, and would keep secrets with a loyalty flesh cannot match. The bell rang when the resin met heat, and though bells belong to a later age, the sound here has always been one, a counting device for wind and water, and the bells ring cut the counting into smaller pieces that fit the hands better. And perhaps this is the logic of ritual, to break impossible choices into gestures the body can learn. We use words like murder or sacrifice because they give us a place to stand, but the stone floor of the cave does not accept our terms. And if you kneel, you can see the scratch of a heel where someone pivoted, not in violence, but in decision. A pivot that feels like the moment before a weight leaves your hands and begins to fall. There is evidence the boy smiled at least once during the preparation, because pitch was found at the corner of his lip in a crescent that suggests a mouth trying not to laugh, and a mother's thumbprint sits pressed into his cheek, softened by centuries, but still a print. And if that doesn't undo you, then I do not know which part of you is listening. They lowered him onto the reeds above the other skull, and they bound his ankles with cord not to restrain, but to instruct the legs to rest. And the cord was tied in a sailor's knot we do not think these people knew. And yet knots travel faster than maps when grief is a teacher. The thing beneath the non-human skull is positioned in such a way that the open part of its mouth aligns with the boy's ear. And if small sounds move through stone the way oils move through cloth, then perhaps there is a reason the boy tilted his head in life. And perhaps bedtime stories were not stories at all, but translations whispered when the adults thought the children slept. We do not know how long the father knelt there after the resin cooled, but the resin fingerprint suggests he touched the boy's cheek and pressed lightly, perhaps to check if the mask's inward gaze had started to make his own head heavier, perhaps to tell his hand this is where the boundary is now. He built a second wall around the pit within a day, a low ring of stones that suggests a hearth and not a grave, and in the weeks after, ash gathered there as if meals had been cooked in orbit of a sleeping star, and you must imagine the family warming their hands at that ring and looking at one another without the word for forgiveness. The village didn't ostracize him. They invited him to sing at the festival that year, and his voice was recorded. if rock scratching is recording, beside a depiction of 7 birds flying into a mouth that is also a door, and there's a circle around one bird that could be joy or warning, depending on whether you have slept, we are left with the worst possibility of all, which is not that he was cruel, but that he was faithful, and that he taught himself to love the world too widely, to keep one breathing thing from being the hinge of a door, so large it would outlast the names for love or door. Even now, in the dig's refrigerated room, the bell sometimes trembles when no one is near, and every intern who has worked a late shift in that room reports the same phenomenon without collusion. They hear, very softly, the strike pattern of 7, -1, then 7 again, and then a gap that feels like a held breath learning to be longer. Why then, was there a mark on the inside of the boy's jaw? A single groove worn into bone, as if his teeth had learned to walk. And why is there resin also on the outside of the bell, which suggests it was in his hand when the first ring happened? And why does the river here never flood as badly as the rivers up and down the valley? An elder's tooth was buried near the pit months later, as if a promise had been paid, and the tooth shows a crack filled with something like resin and something like pine, and the crack runs toward the crown as if chasing a sound, and then stops as if it had caught it. In the months after the burial, the village crop yields are accorded in coils of rope with knots fat and close together, a way of saying plenty that feels like blessing. But the knotted cords used to record births thin out for a span of time that is exactly 7 winters long. Perhaps the father wore the ring with 40 notches until his hand thinned enough that the ring slid free one morning and fell into a corner where dust had been told to behave itself, and perhaps the river mouth and the sky closed for a while, and perhaps the geese lowered their heads at last and slept. We told ourselves we would leave it that, close the file, store the bones, write the article with the words ritual and likely, and rest. And then someone brushed the dirt from the underside of the father's mask and found a final carving, so fine it looked like breath had cut it, a carving of a small child holding the mask and facing outward, toward the world, not inward toward the pit. The child in the carving wears no resin on the mouth, and the eyes are open, and the pupils are rendered with the depth made by a bone needle, and the gaze is not pleading or sad but steady. And even now it makes you lift your hand to your own mouth, without thinking. Does it not? You expected a confession, a name for the thing beneath the boy's head, a proof that the village believed a lie or a god. But the last page of the journal is not a conclusion, but a question carved into the handle of the bell. If the mouth of the sky learned your child's name before you do, whose child is it? I did not plan to tell you this next part because I know how it sounds, and you will search for wires or magnets or drafts. But the night we closed the tent after measuring the mask, I heard the bell ring once, then again, then a pattern that skipped only the 7th strike, and I realized my own breath had been matching it since the story began. Maybe you think this is just narrative gravity, the way details fall toward endings, but answer me this. How did the resin stay glossy in that dry air? Why does the lash of feathers still hold under a touch and yet crumble under a breath? And why do the photographs of the boy's boots always show muddy prints beside them when there was no mud anywhere near the table? The final object removed from the pit was a small spindle of wood darkened by the oils of hands, and on its surface someone had scratched circles with lines through them, elaborate and consistent, and the circles, when translated into calendar, mark a date that is exactly today, and the surface ends with an unfinished circle, as if the hand that scratched it had been interrupted by a bell. If he was a father and not a monster, then he believed he was ending a life to keep the world whole. And if he was a monster, then he believed the same thing, because monsters are often the ones who cannot tell when a metaphor has left the room and asked to be fed. I have not told you what happened when the team returned at dawn to inventory the remains and found the second skull misaligned by the width of a finger, and the reed braid coiled as if memory can roll itself tighter when watched, and the mask moved an inch toward the door, and the ring with 40 notches now sitting where a hand could find it without looking. There's one more note, written in a rush and jammed beneath the edge of a crate, and it reads, "Do not speak your own name near the bell." And when you read it, you will find your mouth wanting to say your name just to see. And when you stop yourself, you will feel the line in the floor where you almost stepped. Perhaps you think none of this is real. An elaborate script written to make you feel complicit, to nudge your heart into a cage, and then leave the key outside the bars while the story stares at you as if you were a more interesting shape than you believe. But answer one last thing for yourself. What would you have done if the sound had started using your child to measure itself? If the river learned to speak through the window and called him by a name that belonged to the sky, and if every path led past the cave mouth that drinks light, and if the air promised peace only if you remembered how to silence a bell with a hand that is not innocent. Don't look away when I tell you that we are not sure the boy died there. Not in the way we mean when we think of pits and resin and knives, because the fractures on his bones say he lived long enough to heal from hurts, and the state of the small muscles that move the face say he knew how to smile at the wrong time, and the position of the spine says he learned to carry weight lightly. And perhaps this is only poetic, and perhaps it is the stupidest science, but there is an argument to be made, that the bell is not a bell, and the pit is not a pit, and the end is not an end but a narrowing. Someone long ago wrote a line on the wall in a pigment that does not fade, and the line says, translated clumsily as all living languages are when applied to dead thought, what is closed to the living opens to the closed, and beneath this smaller hand has added, seventh to breathe, and then, much later, someone else has added a date that matches ours by accident or by habit or by something else. Do you feel it? The way your breath has been counted without your permission, the way the part of your mind that keeps your name alive between blinks is leaning toward a door, the way the wind rose twice as you listened and then settled as if waiting for an answer you have no intention of giving. I have a final image for you, and then you can decide whether you will sleep. The father, standing at the mouth of the cave after the last stone was placed, holding the small boots against his chest as if they were lungs, and the river's sound traveling up from below as if the valley itself had learned to whisper, and the bell in his pocket cooling against his thigh with the memory of a ring that does not stop. He turns toward home with the boots in his arms and the mask in the dark behind him, and the stars above looking like scales on something too large to name, and his shadow is long in the last light. And somewhere a goose finally sleeps with its head under its wing, and he thinks, perhaps for the first and only time, that he has done a good thing in a hard world, and that he has earned a quiet night. When he reaches the doorway, the dog lifts its head but does not bark, and the mother takes the boots and places them upright against the wall where a child can find them in the morning, and they eat, and the low ring of stones glows, and their voices stay low, because the air has rules now, and later they lie down, and the night listens, and they sleep. No one wrote what happened next in words, because words would have made it smaller, but the marks on the doorframe grow one notch that week, and from then on they grow each 7th week, with a regularity that looks like a tied line, and feels like a choice someone keeps making, and the rope that records births thickens again, and the fish painted on the wall is one day found with a second hand, carved by an older tool, reaching back out of the mouth to touch the knife that once cut the rope. The cave still holds what it holds, and the bell still waits the way an eye waits behind a mask, and the question the father asked still fits in your mouth if you are not careful. And if you find yourself counting your breaths tonight with a skip you cannot correct, then ask yourself whether you are counting to stay alive or counting to keep something else from arriving. I am leaving you with this because the final artifact, the spindle with the circles, has one last mark hidden in the grain, a line that aligns with our present year in a way that makes coincidence feel like a weak word, and the line ends not in a circle, but in a small carving of a face with closed eyes and an open mouth, and the mouth is shaped like a bell. But the skull didn't belong to her, and the mask did not belong to the father alone, and the bell may not belong to any of us now. So tell me, when the 7th breath comes for you the way the wind comes for valleys like this, will you recognize the sound, or will you offer a name you have kept safe since childhood, because somewhere beneath your floorboards, something has been practicing silence for centuries, and has only been waiting for you to listen long enough to hear it answer back.